Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we're now in the home stretch. This is the second part of lecture 10. And in the remaining part, I'm going to put together what I would call a prototype model, which combines the dynamic indeterminacy we studied in lectures 1 through 9 with models with steady state indeterminacy. So I'm going to begin by showing how multiple steady state unemployment equilibria can be introduced to an otherwise standard real business cycle model. And then I'm going to take you through two versions of Keynesian search models and show you their dynamic properties. And I'm going to be arguing that which of those versions, or indeed some other version, is the right one to think about is an empirical problem. So we're now at the stage where we're asking, we have models where beliefs matter. To ask how beliefs matter, we need to estimate objects that, in my own work, I call belief functions. So let me take you through the variables that are described by a canonical real business cycle model. I will put together the canonical real business cycle model, and then I will show you how to amend that model in a way that drops the second postulate and replaces it with animal spirits, which is really, I think, what everything in Keynes was all about. C subscript T will be aggregate consumption. Y subscript T will be GDP. I is investment. G is government purchases. K is the capital stock. L will be hours in employment. S will be an exogenous productivity shock. And W over P will be the real wage. So those are all familiar symbols. So there are 8 variables there. Here are the 8 equations that go along with those variables. There is a production function. I guess I've written it here with the timing here is different from the timing I gave you earlier, but that's just a convention. So this is a Cobb-Douglas production function. This is a capital accumulation equation. This is Keynes's first postulate. This is Keynes's second postulate, and the difference here from the version that I showed you in the first part of the lecture is this is assuming a different version of the utility function. So this is what the labor supply equation would look like if utility was log of consumption minus L to the 1 plus gamma over 1 plus gamma. It's just a different utility assumption. There's an Euler equation. There's an accounting identity. And then there are 2 time series processes for the Solow residual and government policy. And in the real business cycle model, so there's no money here at this point, although money is relatively easy to add. But in the real business cycle model, fiscal policy is necessarily passive. Now, how do you know that? Well, because I've not written any equation here for taxation. And I don't need the equation for taxation because it's the flip side of the budget equation of the consumer. And we know that the budget equation of the consumer is going to hold because we're going to impose the transversality condition on the Euler equation. So once you impose the transversality condition on the Euler equation, whatever the timing of taxes is, the government budget constraint is going to hold with probability 1. So I think that's an interesting point to notice, at least in real business cycle models. Okay. So what is this indeterminacy agenda that I've described for you, and how does it work? Well, it has 2 components. First, it's a movement beyond the representative agent to look at models based on overlapping generations or perpetual youth models. We have 1 unit each period. Here there's a continuum of people of different generations. Their endowment declines at rate lambda. the number of people in each generation declines at rate chi. And this is the recursive equation that I wrote down earlier this week for human wealth. There are complete financial markets. This is just the budget equation at period t. So everybody alive at date t is holding this much in financial assets. This is their wealth. Actually, there's a term missing here because this needs also to include expenditure on leisure, and I've not written that piece in here. But so this would be the version of the model with fixed labor supply. The left-hand side are the uses of funds, so you can consume, or you can purchase assets that pay off next period, and there's a complete set of these things. And if leisure enters the utility function, there would also be here, there would be plus expenditure on leisure. This term here says that the financial assets of everybody alive today is identically equal to the capital stock plus the liabilities of the government. This equation, and again, this is the version with fixed labor, with constant labor. This equation says that consumers consume a fixed fraction of their wealth. What's their wealth? It's human wealth plus financial wealth. And finally, this is an asset pricing equation. It says that you can price any asset using this pricing kernel, and that relates the pricing kernel here and the prices here to the real return on capital. So the first change I would envisage, you could take a market clearing version of the RBC model and write it as a perpetual youth version of it. The perpetual youth version will have two steady state equilibria. One of them will be indeterminate. And right off the bat, you've got some very different properties of that model from ones that are populated by a representative agent. And there's a great deal of flexibility, very little work done on thinking about even the market clearing version of that model is not well understood or well worked out. Okay. So in particular then, what this slide is saying is exactly what I just repeated. It's the block. That block of equations will lead to multiple steady states, monetary and non-monetary steady states, and they will correspond to B is equal to 0 or B is equal to non-zero. And the kind of equilibria you get with production are very, very similar to the endowment economies that we studied in the first 9 lectures. They are the perpetual youth model with capital is a close analog of the work that Peter Diamond did on national debt in a neoclassical growth model in the 80s, maybe even earlier than that, in which he looked at a 2-period version of an overlapping generations model with capital. So that's how you would put the indeterminacy agenda into a real business cycle model. Now, to keep life as simple as possible, in the remaining part of this lecture, I'm not going to do that. Instead of talking about this whole block of equations here and multiple steady states and dynamic indeterminacy, I'm going to revert to the representative agent version of this model with an Euler equation. Instead, I'm going to modify the supply, what I call the supply side of the model. And I'm going to replace the assumption of a Walrasian auction each period with what I've called elsewhere Keynesian search theory. By a Walrasian auction, I mean that in each period, the quantity of labor demanded is equal to the quantity of labor supplied, and the real wage adjusts to make that equation hold. Instead, I'm going to drop the labor supply equation, and I'm going to put in a technology, a search technology for moving people between home and work. So, question, what does it mean then to replace the Walrasian auction model of the labor market? Well, this is the Walrasian auction model of the labor market. The left-hand side of this equation is Keynes's second postulate. The right-hand side is Keynes's first postulate. This is my assertion that the general theory is all about removing this equation. We're going to get rid of that postulate. Well, if we get rid of that postulate, we're going to have to add something. Here's a link to the confidence crashes paper, which I talked about in the first year class, which provides a much deeper explanation than I will have time for in this lecture to explain to you how the labor market works. If you want a summary of those ideas, again, it's the paper in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that is the third article listed on the readings on the first slide of today's lecture. So my assertion then is Keynesian economics has nothing to do with frictions that prevent prices from quickly adjusting, as it does in New Keynesian economics. Instead, in Keynesian search theory, what's missing are factor markets. So let me explain what I mean by that. But first of all, let me say that because of missing factor markets, the prevailing unemployment rate in a Keynesian search model is determined by aggregate demand and not by equating the demand and supply of labor. And aggregate demand is itself determined by a new fundamental, the belief function, which is a way of modeling what Keynes meant by animal spirits. So let me try verbally to explain Keynesian search theory, and you can look at the mathematics behind this by going a little more deeply into the articles that I've cited. So the key idea, the most important idea from search theory, now what's search theory? Search theory is usually identified with the Nobel Prize that was awarded to Peter Diamond, Chris Pissarides, and Dale Mortensen a few years back. And in search theory, just as in what I'm calling Keynesian search theory, I refer to their work as classical search theory, there's no auction market for labor. Instead, search theory recognizes that to match an unemployed worker with an opportunity for a job at a firm, there's a matching process. And that matching process uses resources. And it's modeled in both versions, Keynesian and classical search theory. So I'm going to take the same structure that they use. It's modeled by a function which tells you that if the unemployment rate is X and the vacancy rate is Y, that the number of jobs created will be Z. And I think of that as the isoquant of a technology. And I'm representing that in this picture. So this isoquant tells you that if the economy needs to fill 40,000 jobs a week, it can do it either with 800,000 unemployed people and 200,000 vacancies, or it could do it with 800,000 vacancies and 200,000 people. So importantly then, there are multiple ways of actually filling a given number of jobs. So you could think of that technology as a neoclassical technology. So the economy has a production function. That's one neoclassical technology that combines capital and labor to produce output. And it has another technology that's a matching technology, which combines vacancies and unemployment to produce newly filled jobs. you could allocate, in these models, you could solve a social planning problem with those two technologies, and then you can decentralize that social planning problem. And if you decentralize the social planning problem, you would need to model the firms that spring into existence to purchase the inputs to the matching technology. Those are unemployed workers and vacancies. Put them together and produce matches, and sell those matches back to the worker firm pairs. And that market for filling vacancies would need two prices, and they would have to be the prices of the right to fill a job for an unemployed person and the right to fill a vacancy for a production firm. So you could imagine that market operating. A recruiting firm, or a headhunting firm, if you like, would go along to unemployed workers and say, I'd like to buy the right to find you a job. And the unemployed worker would say, great, how much will you give me? And the headhunting firm would say, well, I'll give you $100 a week until I find you a job. And the unemployed person says, great, fantastic. And then the headhunting firm goes to the production firm and says, I'd like to fill your vacancy for you. And the production firm says, great, how much will you pay me for that? And the headhunting firm says, I'll give you $200 a week. And the matching firm says, fantastic, great. So those are two relative prices. In a competitive market, firms will enter or leave, the competitive prices will adjust, and there will be a relative price of vacancies to unemployment that will adjust to find the right, the socially optimal unemployment rate, and there will be one. Now, that's not what appears to happen in practice, because we just do not see those markets for the inputs to the search process. Most likely a consequence of moral hazard problems. If you were to go to an unemployed person and say, I'll give you $100 a week for the exclusive right to find you a job, there's nothing to stop that person going to another matching company and say, selling that right twice. And then one of the matching firms comes along and says, I found you a job, now you have to pay me for the job. The unemployed person simply could say, well, I'm very sorry, I have to get married next week and I can't take that job because. And as a consequence of issues like that, those markets don't exist. That's well understood. It was understood by the people who initially constructed classical matching theory. And instead, they assumed that the matching process is random. So unemployed people wander around in the dark, they bump into firms who have vacancies, and when they meet, there's a match. Now, if you follow that route, you find that once you put together a general equilibrium model, you have fewer equations than unknowns. And you have fewer equations than unknowns because these two relative prices, the price for the exclusive right to find a job for an unemployed person, and the price for the exclusive right to fill the vacancy of a production firm, those two prices are missing. There's only one price, and that's the real wage of a job. And as a consequence, there's a missing equation. And the way that classical search theory solved that problem was to add a new equation. And the new equation said that workers and firms are not price takers. Instead, when a worker meets a firm, they bargain over the real wage. There's a new parameter, which is the bargaining weight of the worker. And that assumption about a bargaining weight picks a particular point on the isoquant. And in data, we appear to observe these isoquants. If you plot unemployment against vacancies in data, what you observe is a downward sloping relationship like this, which is called the Beveridge curve. Okay. So what I do in Keynesian search theory is The whole apparatus of classical search theory remains the same, but I drop this assumption of the Nash bargain. And instead, I assume that firms and workers are indeed both price takers, but I close the model by introducing what I call a belief function for assets. Now, first thing I want to point out to you is that the production function with a search technology and the production function without a search technology, for reasonable calibrations, look almost identical. So here, I'm plotting the employment rate between 0 and 1 and GDP with a Cobb-Douglas production function, or rather an isoelastic production function on this axis. So the first graph I'm plotting, which is the dashed red line, that's the function is equal to L to the B, to some value of B. The blue line is the function y is equal to x to the b, where x, which is employed labor, is this actual function of x is labor used to produce goods, is this rather complicated looking function of labor employed. And where this comes from is an equilibrium model of the matching process. So some of the resources, the reason these are not identical is that some of the resources that are employed are used in the search process, and so they can't all be used to produce goods. And that gets a more significant problem the closer you get to full employment. So as you get up here towards full employment, these two things begin to diverge dramatically. And the reason is because the closer you are to full employment, the harder it becomes to fill a vacancy. If there's only, if you've got a vacancy to fill and there's 1 million people unemployed, you can do it relatively costlessly. If you've got a vacancy to fill and there's only 3 people unemployed in the whole US economy, you're going to have to put huge amounts of resources into making sure that you're the one who gets one of those 3 people as to everybody else. And that's what's going on in this representation of a production function. All right, so in this paper then, the importance of beliefs that I cited at the beginning of the talk, I look at 2 ways of closing a model, both of which have this search technology, and they're closed with different versions of what I call a belief function. And I'm going to describe for you now what those versions look like and why either of these models appears to be a better way of understanding recessions than either New Keynesian or classical models. And the important idea, what these models are going to better be able to capture, is the co-movement of consumption and employment that characterizes pretty much all recessions. I should say that feel free to interrupt me at any point here. I know that you know that, but let's move on. All right, so here's version 1 of what I will call a Keynesian search model. In version 1, I'm going to take the equations of the RBC model. That's these equations here. I'm going to get rid of equation 4, and I'm going to replace it with the assumption that investment is exogenous. Now, I know some of you learned the Keynesian cross diagram as undergraduates. Others of you may not have done. This is exactly the Keynesian cross diagram. It's a souped up version of the Keynesian cross diagram. Investment is driving demand, demand is driving employment, and all I've done is sort of grafted this into a consistent microeconomic foundation. Version 2 is a little more sophisticated. Version 2 is an attempt to capture some ideas that I found in my empirical work, which is that stock market prices are closely aligned with movements in unemployment. And here I'm going to introduce a variable that I call beliefs about the future value of the stock market. And I'm going to assume that this belief variable is a first order regression. I'm interested in that version because of this paper, again, it's subsidiary reading, in which I did got a couple of papers on the connection between asset prices and unemployment. And in particular, this is a graph that I've taken from that second paper. This is post-war US data. The gray line is the log of the S&P 500 in real terms. The black line is the log of a logistic transformation of the unemployment rate. Both of these variables can move in anywhere in the real line. They are both well characterized by random walks, but they're co-integrated, and you can see that in the fact that at low frequencies these things are moving together, but at high frequencies they can diverge quite a lot. Okay, so this is the model restated. It was remember that the real business cycle model was an 8-equation model. That was it here. So I'm going to take all of these equations, but I'm going to throw out equation 4. So that gives me 7 remaining equations, and those are these equations here, 1 through 7. I'm going to replace the labor supply equation, which is now missing, with something I'll show you in a moment. But I'm also introducing 2 subsidiary equations here because I'm going to be interested not only in how the 8 variables I initially described move. I'm also going to be interested in how the real interest rate moves over the cycle. So that's just a definition of the real interest rate. And I'm going to be interested in how the stock market moves. And I'm going to define the stock market to be the discounted present value of the return to capital. So capital here owns a fraction alpha of GDP. And here all I'm doing is I'm defining Z to be the discounted present value discounted by these real interest rates of all future values of the stock market. And I can add these 2 equations to the real business cycle model, and I will. Now, what about the Keynesian search models? Well, because I've thrown out the labor supply equation, so that's what I'm saying here, that to turn this model, to turn these 9 equations into a real business cycle model, you would simply add back in this equation, the labor supply equation. Instead, in version 1 of the Keynesian model, I'm going to replace the labor supply equation with an equation that describes how investment changes over time. And in version 2, I'm going to replace it with this block of equations. So the first equation here tells you how beliefs about the value of the stock market change over time. And the second equation tells you the relationship of beliefs about the value of the stock market with the actual realization of the stock market. Now, notice something really interesting here. This equation, ZET, this is the date T conditional expectation of the value of the discounted present value of profits as of next period. What this equation says is that your belief about the discounted present value of future profits is rational. It's equal to the actual conditional expectation, conditional on all information in the model. So this is a rational expectations assumption. But in addition to the rational expectations assumption, I'm going to introduce animal spirits. So this belief is not only rational, it's also generated by a backward-looking belief function. And this is a very arbitrary belief function. This is the kind of thing that you need to look at data at to find out what really does drive beliefs. It could be reading the Wall Street Journal, which would be what this supply shock is. So I've written it here as an autocorrelated process driven by random shocks, which converges back to this number z bar. Now, what I showed you in data is that this parameter is actually very close to 1. So this thing, your beliefs about the value of the stock market wander around like a random walk. But here, this is the stationary version of that representation of the model. Okay. In the remaining slides, I'm going to show you what some impulse response functions look like if you close the model that I've just described, either with a temporary shock to investment in what I call, so when I say refer to version 1 of the model, I mean replace the labor supply curve with this equation. When I refer to version 2 of the model, I mean replace the labor supply equation with this pair of equations. And in all of the models, I'm retaining the stock market defined like this and the real interest rate defined like this. And notice R is just the inverse of the pricing kernel. Okay. So let's look at this. So what's the experiment? The experiment in this model is to set the economy equal to its steady state, and then at period 1 to shock investment by 10 units. So that's a 10% deviation from the steady state value. And government purchases I'm going to keep constant, so they don't move during the whole simulation. Investment spikes up to 10, and then it converges back slowly to the steady state. And here the decay rate is 0.9. So that's simply an expression of this equation. If you hit, so this starts out at I bar, shock it by 10%, and watch how it returns to I bar, and it returns at rate 0.9, and that's what you're seeing in this blue simulation. Okay. Now, what happens to GDP? Well, GDP increases by about 3%, 3.5%, and converges to the steady state. So investment is more volatile than GDP. Consumption increases by about 2% and returns to the steady state. Employment increases by about 4.5% and returns slowly to the steady state. The capital stock increases and returns very slowly to the steady state, asymptotically back to 0, but it's going to take a very long time because this investment has increased the capital stock, and eventually it will come back to its long-run steady state, but it takes a lot longer. And here, this is what's happening in the asset markets. The blue line shows you what happens to the stock market. So the investment shock generates a boom to the stock market. It also generates a boom to expected future values of the stock market. That's the red line. And it increases real interest rates. So those of you who remember, who were ever taught as undergraduates the ISLM model, where you have the interest rate in GDP, an LM curve, an IS curve, this is like an IS shock. It drives up real interest rates, it drives up consumption, GDP, and employment, and then it gradually reverts to the steady state. So that's kind of interesting. So this is a well-defined, micro-founded model that delivers for you pretty much exactly the textbook Keynesian ISLM model, with no assumption of sticky prices whatsoever, but a well-defined adjustment process. Okay, in this same model, we can ask what happens not if there's a shock to investment, if there's a shock to government purchases. And this is showing you that. So, what's the question here? You know, we're in a recession. Can the government stimulate GDP and employment. And here, remember that the assumption is that government purchases are driven by, again, simple first order regressive process. And what I'm going to do here is look at an experiment where the world has been in a steady state equilibrium forever. And then at date 1, there's a 10% increase in government purchases, which then return, again, at a rate of 0.9 back to their benchmark level, to G bar. What happens? Well, again, GDP, there's a multiplier. GDP increases here by only 2%. It's much lower than the investment multiplier. Notice the capital stock doesn't do anything. It stays exactly where it was because investment doesn't do anything. Because by assumption, investment is just this first order process that depends only on lagged investment. But employment does. So this boost in government purchases stimulates employment. So yes, we can reduce unemployment with a government purchase shock. Eventually it returns to zero. But here's the interesting thing. Notice that this spike in government purchases causes a reduction in consumption. So that's something that's actually different from the textbook ISLM model, because in the textbook ISLM model, consumption is a function of income. And if consumption is a function of income, consumption should go up at the same time GDP goes up. That's not what we see in data. So if you look in particular at the biggest government purchase shock in American history, which is World War II, there's a big spike in government purchases, but a reduction in consumption, exactly what we're seeing in this version of the Keynesian search model. What happens to the stock market? Well, first of all, let's look at the real return. The real return, again, think of the ISLM model. Increase rightward shift in the IS curve drives up real interest rates. That happens here too. But the stock market crashes. So this increase in government purchases causes a reduction in the value of the stock market in this model. Okay. So those are interesting features. But a more interesting question, I think, is can we make this permanent? So could we increase government spending and permanently raise GDP? That would be interesting if we could. So what happens when this persistence parameter in the case of an investment shock, or in the case of a government spending shock, what happens if we take that to 1? And that's the next question I'm going to ask. So this is the impulse response in version 1 of the old Keynesian, of the Keynesian search model, to a permanent 10% increase in investment, again, with no change in government purchases. Well, if we permanently raise investment by 10%, we're going to permanently raise the capital stock asymptotically by 10%. And notice also, in this model, we are going to permanently increase employment by 10%. Now, the only way that can happen is if our benchmark that we're starting from was an underemployment equilibrium. So if unemployment is stuck at 15% and we increase investment by 10% and hold it there forever, what this says is the unemployment rate will fall from 15% to 5% and stay there forever. We will permanently increase GDP. We will permanently increase consumption. It's very good for the stock market. The stock market will boost by 10%. And there'll be a little blip in the real rate of return, which then returns asymptotically back to zero. Why is that? Because in this model with a representative agent, the long run real rate of return is pinned down by the agent's rate of time preference. So that's a feature of this possibility of multiple steady state equilibria. We're moving from one steady state equilibrium to another with a permanent increase in investment. Well, that's kind of interesting. So let's look at the Keynesian story for the Great Depression. The Keynesian story from the Great Depression is that the Great Depression was caused by a reversal of this shock. A loss in confidence caused investment to fall. So we moved from 3% unemployment to 24% unemployment. And the Keynesian remedy, which you might think would work, was to increase government spending to get employment back on track. Well, will that work? Well, if the shock to investment, it was a permanent decrease in investment, you'd think it would need a permanent increase in government spending to restore employment, but that's not what happens. So here I'm looking at what happens if we start out from an equilibrium that we've been in forever, could be a 15% unemployment equilibrium, and investment stays exactly where it was, but government purchases of consumption goods, that's important, increase by 10% forever. What happens? Well, all that happens is consumption falls by, here only 5% forever. Why 5%? That's because a 4.7% reduction in consumption is equal to a 10% increase in government purchases in terms of total number of goods, because the government sector here is a smaller proportion of the economy than the private sector. So what do we learn from this? We learn that permanent and temporary shocks have very different effects. There are potentially permanent demand-driven effects, but the only way we can really get them operating is by getting investment, by restoring investment. Now, you could, if you think that the Great Depression was caused by a permanent drop in private investment, you could replace that with a permanent increase in government investment, but that would, that would involve essentially government control of a lot of the productive sectors of the economy, and I'm not sure that's what you want to be recommending. Okay, so that's version 1.
Sir, I have a question on your version 1.
Yeah.
I just wondered, for the case that in the settings of the model, where is the financing comes from the investment shock that we get?
That's a very good question. So if we go up here, so there's an asset market behind all of this, and as a consequence of, sorry, I've got the wrong one. So think about the investment shock, right? And you're saying, how is that financed? It's financed because individuals increased employment and increased GDP, so there's more output, and a fraction of that output goes through the asset markets to investment. So I actually described this in detail in that paper, in the Oxford Review paper. There's a section at the end that takes you through exactly the financing story of how this works, and it's going to be different in this case and the other case. So here, what's going on is that there's a bunch of people who are responsible for running corporations, and they get kind of enthusiastic. So they say, let's just let's build a whole bunch more machines this period. Okay. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to have to. Well, so first of all, remember, this is an MIT shock, right? It's an MIT shock in the sense that the changes that occur in the current period were not ones that were anticipated last period. So the first thing that happens is that the value of the assets that are held by existing people, so these people are holding claims on firms, and they're holding claims on the government. Now, this big boost in investment, that increases the value of their claims on firms. So that's jumping up immediately in response to the increase in investment. A whole bunch of them get employed, jobs go up, and more gets produced. And of that amount that's produced, some of it is consumed. And you're saying, how is the financing taken care of. Well, it's partly, initially, it's an increase in the value of assets, but the goods, so I'm not sure what you mean by financing, the goods themselves are coming from increased production. And it's still going to be true that, importantly, consumption is a function of physical and human wealth. So it's a function of these financial assets that goes up. But these guys also foresee that their future income is going to go up because they now know that future wages are going to go up, employment is going to go up, and as a consequence, their human wealth has gone up, and as a consequence, they also consume more in the initial period. Does that help?
Yeah, I think this kind of, but not exactly answer my questions, I think. So the main idea is, in other words, just where do that initial money for the investment comes from? I think it's the main.
What do you mean by money? This is a real economy at this point.
Okay, so basically the economy was generated a MIT shock. So to me, it sounds like there is a bunch of investment, so all suddenly out of the blue just came into the economy.
So look at it this way. So every period, there's a bunch of stuff produced, right? And it's produced from capital and labor, right? And every period, the quantity of labor that's applied to the fixed existing stock of capital is endogenously determined by beliefs of households, right? So now we've been in this equilibrium forever, and there's 15% unemployment forever in the past. And all of a sudden, these firms get really enthusiastic and they say, I actually want to invest more. So they go to in the goods market, the people producing the goods, the consumption goods and the investment goods, they see this increase in demand currently for their goods, and this is all happening within the period. Demand goes up, so they hire more people than they otherwise would have done. So in the background, there's this labor market which is churning all the time, and there's always people being unemployed, people coming back, and so on. And now the firms that are hiring workers, they hire a whole bunch more workers than they otherwise would have done, and as a consequence, more gets produced, and as a consequence, some of this stuff goes to consumption, and some of this stuff goes to meet this enthusiastic investment demand that's coming. And these guys, the workers, they were holding assets. Those assets are now worth more. But also, the firms, because they now want to invest more capital in the future, so this is KT plus 1, that has to be funded from saving. And saving goes up too. Why does saving go up? Because GDP's gone up, employment's gone up, we've got now more, we're going to consume some of it, but we're also going to save some of it to help finance this increase in future capital. So that's all going on in the background of this story. You're asking all the right questions, guys. Okay. So let's look at version 2. This looks a lot more like a consumption boom. And I want you to notice something else, because look at the time period. So this is 0 to 70 quarters. Quarters or years? I can't remember how I did it. 70 periods. This, in the permanent response, here I'm going from 0 to 120 periods. So I did that to show you that in the permanent case, it takes a very long time to get to the new steady state. But now I'm only looking at 14 quarters or 14 periods. So the shock to beliefs is a lot less persistent in its effects on output. Now, what happens here is the shock is to beliefs about the S&P. So what goes up is this red line. You believe that next period you're going to be wealthier, and as a consequence, you consume more, and because firms recognize that there'll be some persistence to this consumption shock, they invest more, and the capital stock goes up. But it all happens in this version of the model. It all happens very rapidly. There's a spike in GDP, but that spike in GDP is very temporary. And this is what happens in the permanent shock to beliefs. Again, there can be a permanent increase in consumption and a permanent increase in employment, but the dynamics in this version of the model are very different. And the point of this is to draw out the fact that different representations of how you model belief shocks, and this is a consequence, this is why I called the paper, why I gave the paper the title I did. The way you model belief shocks is going to have very important consequences for the dynamics of the data. Now, that's a good thing, because it means that empirically, you should be able to distinguish between different versions of modeling the belief function. If you model the belief function as investor beliefs about simply what they should be buying, that leads to one statement. That's the kind of cross statement. If you try and do it in a more sophisticated way in terms of these expectations about future stock markets, you'll get much more temporary dynamics. And my guess is if you run a horse race of these two models against each other, and in fact, Diego, who's working with me, he was a student a year or two ago, is working with me on estimating this model. He's actually doing this right now using data from the Great Depression. And what he's finding is that version 1 of this model is a much better description of what's happening than version 2. That's not to say there isn't some other version which is better than both. Okay. Any questions about that last set of statements on the stock market? So Gavin, I always knew you were a shadow on Keynes. Because you have no light in front of you, you're coming out as a big shadow in front of Keynes.
Well, the only thing is my room's actually very well lit, but my camera just sucks.
Oh, okay, time to buy a new camera. Okay, guys, so let me conclude. So the purpose of this lecture was not to delve into steady state indeterminacy deeply, because I don't have time. It was to describe for you the intellectual coherence of the agenda, which is that the economy clearly does not work like a classical RBC model, in my view, and there are many violations, and I showed you 2 of them, of data that the simple model violates. The new Keynesian fix is not a good fix for 2 reasons. One is that prices simply just don't display enough stickiness to be able to describe these aggregate features. And secondly, it's these co-movements between consumption and labor supply, which are very difficult to catch. Now, the way that that's caught in the real business cycle model is to assume that labor supply is infinitely elastic. And that gets you some of the way there if you're willing to assume that what's driving business cycles are shocks to labor productivity. It doesn't get you all the way there, because if you allowed the models to violate concavity, you'll find that they actually want employment to violate the assumptions of concave utility functions. So it really doesn't help you that much. In the international literature, there's something called Greenwood-Herkovic-Husband preferences, which again is an attempt to try to get labor and consumption moving in the right direction. These are not good fixes in my view. There's asset market features, which is I think, the purpose of introducing dynamic indeterminacy. And those features suggest that in the data, there's a lot more volatility in asset markets that we can easily explain with models of single determinant equilibria. And dynamic indeterminacy, as I showed you on Tuesday, is a way of really getting to grips with that. The purpose of today's lecture was to show you how these models of Keynesian search can help understand persistence in unemployment rates and their connections with asset markets. So where I'd like to leave you with at the end of these 10 weeks of lectures, or 10 lectures, not 10 weeks, 5 weeks of lectures, is a consistent, coherent agenda for applying the empirical techniques you learned last year with the ideas of the indeterminacy agenda. And moving forward, I think there's a huge amount of scope for using these models to understand important policy questions in macroeconomics, which have to do with things like, if asset markets are unstable and non-Pareto optimal, are there asset market interventions that we should be thinking about or recommending that can help improve that? If large recessions lead to persistent unemployment, can we and should we be intervening to stop that? And if so, is the optimal intervention through increasing government purchases, or is it again through some intervention in asset markets as opposed to goods markets? And finally, putting these ideas together with the empirical concepts that we learned about last year, there's a way forward in giving us some attempt to try to empirically discipline these models by, I would say, estimation as opposed to calibration, and seeing how quantitatively important some of the features that I've introduced might potentially be. So that's it. That's 10 lectures, 5 weeks of lectures, and it's been lots of fun teaching you all.